The wild calls to us, not always with a voice, but with a silent plea that echoes deep within the soul. Eleanor Vance, though few beyond the infrequent supply pilot or the distant, taciturn ranger knew her by anything but Ellie, had long answered that call. Her existence was a meticulously woven tapestry of quiet routine, spun in the heart of the rugged Pacific Northwest forests, miles from the nearest paved road. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, stood as a solitary sentinel against the vast, indifferent expanse of towering firs and ancient cedars, its chimney a slender column of smoke against the gray, often rain-laden sky. Each dawn brought a familiar cadence to her days, the crackle of a wood stove fire, the scent of strong coffee brewing, then the methodical tending of her small, fenced garden, even in the bite of late autumn, where hardy greens clung stubbornly to life. Her hands, strong and calloused, moved with a practiced ease, coaxing sustenance from the grudging earth. Beyond the cabin's immediate clearing lay her trapping lines, a necessary practice for both sustenance and the trade that brought her the few manufactured goods she couldn't forge or gather herself. These weren't for profit, not truly. They were a means to an end, a quiet agreement with the land that demanded its due. Her treks through the snow-laden trails were more than mere errands. She moved with a silent grace, her worn leather boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen crust, her breath pluming white in the crisp air. For hours she would walk, sometimes for 10, sometimes for 12 miles, her eyes scanning the subtle language of the forest, the faint track of a deer, the disturbed snow where a fox had pounced, the high-flying hawk circling above. These long, solitary journeys were her meditations, her conversations with the whispering pines, her ears attuned to the distant, often mournful, calls of the wildlife that shared her isolated world. She was, in many ways, a creature of the forest herself, shaped by its relentless demands and its breathtaking, untamed beauty. The wilderness had carved lines into her face, etched a quiet strength into her frame, but it had not hardened her spirit entirely. Beneath the practical, resilient exterior of a woman who could fell a tree, mend a broken trap, or navigate a blizzard, lay a profound, almost instinctual empathy for the natural world. She understood its cycles of life and death, its brutal necessities, yet she also felt a kinship with its inhabitants, a quiet sorrow for suffering, a deep respect for survival. This was not a sentimental weakness, but a fundamental part of her being, a silent code she lived by. Her life was simple, unadorned, yet rich in its stark, uncompromising truth, a constant negotiation with the elements and the wild souls that roamed freely around her. She was a woman who saw the world not through the lens of human dominion, but as a delicate, intricate web in which every living thing held its own, often precarious place. It was one of those afternoons when the sun, a pale, watery disk, seemed to offer no warmth, merely a fleeting illusion of light against the oppressive gray sky. The air itself felt brittle, sharp with the promise of a deeper cold, and the snow, which had fallen relentlessly for 3 days, lay thick and unforgiving. Ellie, bundled in layers of wool and canvas, her breath a steady plume, was checking the farthest reaches of her trapping lines, a route she rarely took in such conditions. A vague unease had pricked at her since morning, a subtle disharmony in the usually predictable rhythm of the forest, urging her deeper into the silent, white expanse. Then, just beyond a cluster of frost-laden alders where the snowdrifts piled particularly high, she saw it, a dark, unnatural blotch against the pristine white. Her initial thought was a downed deer, perhaps, or a stray, but as she drew closer, her steps slowing, a prickle of cold recognition spread through her. It was a wolf. Not just any wolf, but a large, gaunt, gray male, its once magnificent coat matted with snow and dried blood. It was caught, brutally and undeniably, in an old, heavy-gauge steel snare, clearly an illegal trap, forgotten or abandoned by some poacher. The wire had bitten deep into its front left leg, twisting flesh and bone into a grotesque, mangled mess. The animal lay half-buried in the snow, its powerful body shivering not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and excruciating pain. Its head was low, its ears flattened, but as Ellie approached, slowly, cautiously, its eyes lifted. They were a piercing, intelligent amber, now glazed with an agony that seemed to drain all light from them. Yet in their depths, she saw something else, a flicker, stubborn and untamed, of wild defiance. This was no cowering creature, despite its suffering. It was a warrior brought low, still capable of snapping, still clinging to the last vestiges of its innate ferocity. The wolf was clearly alone, a solitary shadow in a world designed for packs. No other tracks marred the snow around it, no sign of kin who might have tried to help, or perhaps, in the brutal logic of the wild, had simply left it behind to spare themselves. Its gaunt flanks, visible beneath the matted fur, spoke of prolonged hunger, and its labored breathing hinted at a rapidly fading life force. In this deepening snow, with its grievous wound, its chances of survival were not merely slim, they were non-existent. The wilderness, usually her quiet companion, now presented a stark, brutal tableau of despair. A wave of conflicting sensations washed over Ellie, a chilling current of fear warring with an overwhelming, almost suffocating sense of pity. Her instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of the wild, screamed at her to retreat, to leave the dying predator to its inevitable fate. A wounded wolf, especially one cornered and in such agony, was a dangerous beast, capable of lashing out with desperate, deadly force. Its teeth, even in its weakened state, could tear flesh, snap bone, and end her own solitary existence in a matter of moments. She could already feel the cold dread tightening in her chest, a primal warning against approaching such raw, untamed despair. Yet, as she held its gaze, those intelligent, pain-racked amber eyes, she saw past the predator, past the potential threat. She saw a creature suffering immensely, a life force flickering at the precipice of oblivion. In that wolf's desperate struggle, in its profound vulnerability, she recognized a mirror of the harsh indifference the wilderness could sometimes show to all its inhabitants, human and beast alike. It was a raw, unfiltered reflection of life's precariousness, a testament to the unforgiving laws of nature that she herself navigated daily. To simply turn away, to abandon it to a slow, agonizing death by cold, starvation, or the gnawing pain of its wound, felt like a betrayal of some unspoken fundamental pact. The thought of leaving it, of allowing the natural, brutal course to take hold without intervention, gnawed at her conscience with an intensity that surprised her. It was a dull, persistent ache, far more unsettling than the immediate fear. Her solitary life had taught her self-reliance, yes, but also a deep respect for life itself, a quiet understanding of the delicate balance that sustained existence in this remote corner of the world. Could she truly walk away, knowing she possessed the means, however risky, to offer a chance, however slim? This was not merely a question of survival, but of morality. A profound dilemma, stark and unyielding, presented itself in the frigid air between her and the suffering animal. It demanded a choice that transcended logic, pushing against the very boundaries of self-preservation. Her mind raced, weighing the immense personal risk against the quiet, insistent voice of her own humanity. The image of the wolf's mangled leg, its glazed, defiant eyes, imprinted itself upon her, refusing to recede. It was a burden she had not sought, a responsibility thrust upon her by the cruel hand of fate, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her next action would define something fundamental about who she was, not just as a survivor, but as Eleanor Vance. The silent plea in the wolf's eyes had pierced through her guarded exterior, demanding an answer. Centuries ago, on the vast American frontier, Tales were whispered around campfires of settlers who, in their desperate struggle for survival against unforgiving winters, would sometimes extend a hand to a starving wild animal, a deer, a stray wolf, not out of sentimentality, but from a profound shared understanding of the thin line between life and death that bound all creatures in the wild. These were not acts of domestication, but moments of raw, unvarnished empathy, echoing a fundamental truth about human nature when stripped bare by the elements. Ellie's mind, usually a quiet, ordered space, became a whirlwind of conflicting imperatives. The fear was visceral, a cold knot in her stomach. The inherent danger of a wild predator, the risk of infection from its wounds, the sheer physical impossibility of moving such a large, heavy animal. There were legal ramifications too, though that felt distant and abstract in the face of the immediate, tangible suffering. To harbor a wolf, a protected species, was a serious offense, let alone to interact with one so intimately. It was a folly, a dangerous fantasy. Yet, beneath the rational fears, a deeper current pulled at her. She saw the unfairness of the snare, a human cruelty inflicted upon a creature of the wild. It wasn't a fair fight, not a natural death. Her own deep-seated respect for life, for the struggle of any living thing to survive, resonated with the wolf's desperate defiance. She was the one who found it. The burden, however unwanted, felt undeniably hers. The echoes of those frontier tales, of shared vulnerability in the face of the elements, weren't just stories. They felt like a deep, ancestral memory stirring within her, a silent pact that transcended species. The decision, when it finally solidified, was less a conscious choice and more an irresistible surge of will. She turned and began the arduous trek back to her cabin, her mind already racing with a plan. The wolf watched her go, its amber eyes tracking her until she disappeared into the swirling snow, a silent, unblinking sentinel of pain. Once inside her cabin, the familiar warmth and scent of wood smoke felt alien. She moved with a focused urgency, gathering supplies. A heavy canvas tarp, thick leather gloves worn supple from years of use, a length of sturdy rope, and, from a locked chest, a small, well-worn leather pouch. Inside were 2 homemade tranquilizer darts and a blowgun, a relic from her father's days, used sparingly for deer if a clean shot wasn't possible, or for sedating injured animals for relocation, a skill he'd taught her long ago. Her hands, though steady, trembled slightly as she checked the darts, a cold dread mixing with a fierce resolve. This was a gamble, the highest stakes she'd ever faced. The return journey to the wolf was fraught with a renewed tension. The snow had deepened, and the light was fading fast. As she approached, the wolf, sensing her presence, lifted its head. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its chest, and it tried to shift, its teeth bared in a snarl, a desperate warning display of its remaining strength. Ellie stopped a good 20 feet away, speaking in a low, calm voice, a steady murmur of reassurance she wasn't sure the wolf understood, but which, she realized, mostly served to calm herself. She slowly unslung the blowgun, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her aim had to be perfect. The wolf was large, but the target area for the dart was small, and its movements, though hampered by the snare, were still quick. She waited, patiently, for a moment of stillness, for the wolf's gaze to lock onto hers, a direct, challenging stare. Then, with a quick, practiced puff, the dart hissed through the air, a silent, almost invisible streak against the falling snow, finding its mark in the thick muscle of its flank. The wolf let out a sharp yelp, a sound of surprise more than pain, and thrashed violently. It snapped at the dart, trying to dislodge it, its eyes burning with fury. Ellie backed away slowly, giving it space, her breath catching in her throat. The next 10 minutes were agonizing. She watched, motionless, as the powerful animal fought the encroaching lethargy.
Its struggles became less frantic, its movements more clumsy, its head growing heavy. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the fire in its amber eyes began to dim, replaced by a dull, unfocused glaze. Finally, with a deep sigh that seemed to release weeks of suffering, its head slumped into the snow, its body going limp. A profound relief washed over Ellie, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She stood there for a moment, letting the tremor in her hands subside, listening only to the howl of the wind and the rapid beat of her own heart. The most dangerous part was over, but the most difficult was just beginning. Approaching the inert form, Ellie moved with meticulous caution, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of premature awakening. The wolf was massive, far heavier than she had anticipated, its fur thick and dense even in its emaciated state.
The snare, a cruel loop of rusted steel wire, was deeply embedded. She knelt, the cold seeping through her thick pants, and began the delicate, dangerous work of cutting the wire. It was old and stiff, requiring all her strength and a pair of heavy-duty cutters from her toolkit. Each snip was a small victory, each strand of metal protesting its release. The stench of fear, blood, and wildness was potent, clinging to the frigid air. When the last strand finally gave way, the wolf's leg, freed from its metallic prison, lay at an unnatural angle, a sickening sight of mangled flesh, exposed bone, and clotted blood. It was worse than she had imagined, a truly grievous injury that would take weeks, if not months, to heal, if it healed at all. Her sanctuary for the wolf was an old woodshed, a sturdy but long unused structure, nestled about 50 yards behind her cabin, obscured by a stand of thick evergreens. It was far enough to offer a degree of separation and avoid drawing immediate attention, but close enough for her to manage the constant care it would require. The shed was dark, filled with the ghosts of old tools and forgotten projects, a thick layer of dust and cobwebs coating everything. She quickly cleared a space, sweeping away debris, and then, with her axe, she chopped down some fresh fir boughs to lay as a soft, fragrant bed, hoping the familiar scent of the forest might offer some small comfort. Dragging the inert wolf through the deep, uneven snow was an immense undertaking. She wrestled the heavy canvas tarp beneath its formidable body, using it as a makeshift sled. Every step was a struggle, her boots sinking into the drifts, her muscles burning with effort. The weight of the animal, even limp, was immense, and the resistance of the snow made it feel like dragging a boulder. Sweat plastered strands of hair to her forehead, and the cold seeped into her bones, but she pushed on, her jaw set, a quiet determination fueling her.
The constant fear of the wolf waking prematurely was a sharp spur, urging her faster, more carefully. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she maneuvered the unconscious animal into the shed, collapsing onto the snowy ground outside, gasping for breath, her entire body aching. Once the wolf was inside, she reinforced the shed door with extra bolts and a heavy bar, ensuring no easy escape, but also made sure there was enough ventilation through a small, high window. A crude bed of hay, brought from a nearby abandoned barn, completed the makeshift infirmary. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and heightened vigilance. The wolf, slowly rousing from the tranquilizer, was a confused, snarling bundle of primal fear and pain. Its initial aggression was fierce, its amber eyes blazing with renewed fury as it tested the confines of its new prison. Ellie had to administer smaller doses of tranquilizer to keep it calm enough for her to approach, a delicate balance between sedation and allowing it to remain alert. She moved like a ghost, meticulously cleaning up any blood or scent trails outside the shed that might draw unwanted attention. The smell of raw meat, blood, and fear permeated the shed, a constant reminder of the dangerous, fragile life she now held in her care. The wound itself was horrifying, deep lacerations, likely a fractured tibia, and a nasty infection already setting in. Ellie relied on her rudimentary knowledge of first aid,
gleaned from old homesteading manuals and her father's practical lessons. She boiled water over her cabin stove, infusing it with antiseptic herbs like yarrow and plantain, creating a strong, fragrant wash. Approaching the wolf with these concoctions was a test of nerves. Its growls were low and menacing, its head snapping dangerously close to her hands as she tried to clean the festering wound. She spoke to it constantly, a soft, soothing stream of words, her voice steady even when her hands trembled.
Slowly, painstakingly, she cleaned the wound, applied compresses, and then, using strips of old, clean linen, she fashioned a crude bandage, wrapping it carefully around the mangled leg. This ritual, fraught with danger and demanding unwavering patience, was repeated twice a day. Sleep was a luxury she barely afforded herself, constantly disrupted by the need to check on her patient, to listen for sounds of distress or renewed aggression. The psychological toll of the secrecy, the constant threat of a wild animal, and the sheer responsibility was immense. She felt an almost palpable sense of being watched, even when the wolf was still, its eyes closed in fitful sleep. Every piece of waste, every bloody bandage was meticulously disposed of, burned, or buried deep to erase any trace of its presence. Her own supplies, already modest, were carefully rationed, as a significant portion now went to the wolf. Slowly, imperceptibly, a shift began to occur. The wolf's initial, unbridled hostility began to recede, giving way to a grudging tolerance. It still watched her, its amber eyes following her every move. But the pure aggression in its gaze softened, replaced by a watchful, analytical curiosity. The first time she approached without it issuing a warning growl, a tiny spark of hope ignited within her. Its body language, initially tense and coiled, began to relax, however subtly, when she was near. She found herself talking to it more, not expecting understanding, but as a way to soothe herself, and, she hoped, the animal. She shared her quiet thoughts, the solitude of her life, the small victories of her day. In the wolf's resilience, she saw a reflection of her own, a shared spirit of survival. This wild, majestic creature, once a symbol of the untamed, was now a silent, secret guest, and a peculiar, almost imperceptible bond grew in the quiet isolation of the shed, forged in the crucible of desperation and shared vulnerability.
As weeks turned into a month, the wolf's physical healing became evident. The infection cleared, the deep lacerations slowly closed, knitting together into a jagged scar that would forever mark its left front leg. The initial limp, a pronounced dragging of its injured limb, gradually lessened, replaced by a more cautious but increasingly confident gait. Muscle mass, slowly rebuilt by the steady diet of venison and broth, returned to its powerful frame, and the gauntness that had so shocked Ellie began to recede. Its fur, once matted and dull, regained its natural luster, thick and vibrant. The restless energy of a wild animal, long suppressed by pain and sedation, began to stir, a clear sign of its burgeoning strength. Its amber eyes, once dulled by suffering, now shone with a renewed intensity, brimming with the raw, untamed spirit that defined its species. One crisp spring morning, the air still holding the bite of winter, but softened by the promise of renewal, Ellie awoke with a strange lightness in her chest. As she made her routine check of the shed, her heart gave a sudden lurch. The heavy bars she had used to secure the door lay on the ground, and the door itself stood ajar, a dark rectangle against the pale morning light. Inside, the shed was empty. The hay she had provided was flattened, still carrying the lingering scent of wildness, but the wolf was gone. It had left as silently and mysteriously as it had arrived, slipping back into the vast wilderness from which it had come. A profound emptiness settled in her heart, a strange mix of relief that it was free, that her dangerous secret was no longer a burden, and an unexpected pang of loneliness. She felt a quiet pride in her achievement, in the life she had saved, an extraordinary act that defied all logic. The wilderness had reclaimed its own, and she returned to her solitary routine, the cabin feeling larger, emptier, carrying the echoes of a presence now gone.
Her life resumed its familiar rhythm, but it was subtly changed, forever marked by the memory of the bond she had forged with the wild. Half a year passed in the relentless, beautiful cycle of the seasons. Summer unfurled its lush green canopy, filling the forest with the hum of insects and the calls of nesting birds. Ellie's days were filled with the familiar tasks of harvesting her garden, preserving what she could, and tending to her traps, though her heart wasn't quite as light as it once was. Autumn then painted the landscape in fiery hues of crimson and gold, a fleeting spectacle before the inevitable descent into winter. The memory of the wolf, a persistent undercurrent, often surfaced in her thoughts. She sometimes imagined she saw its shadow among the trees, a fleeting glimpse of gray in her peripheral vision, or heard a distant howl that sounded uncannily familiar, carrying a unique resonance that made her pause, her senses sharpening. She would dismiss it, of course, as a trick of the mind, a longing for that peculiar, dangerous connection she had briefly shared. Yet a part of her, a deep, intuitive part, held on to the possibility, however remote, that their paths might one day cross again. This new winter, however, was exceptionally harsh. The first snows began to fall earlier than usual, thick and heavy, blanketing the forest in a shroud of white that promised a long, brutal season. Temperatures plummeted faster than she had ever witnessed, and the silence of the wilderness grew more profound, punctuated only by the creak of freezing branches and the distant, mournful cries of creatures struggling to survive. An almost palpable sense of desperation settled over the land, a tightening of the natural world's grip. Then, one bitter evening, as a blizzard raged outside, a maelstrom of swirling snow and howling wind that rattled the very foundations of her cabin, Ellie heard it. A faint scratching at her cabin door, distinct from the relentless assault of the storm. It was a sound that sent a jolt of ice through her veins, a sound utterly out of place. No human would be out in such a tempest, and any wild creature would be seeking shelter, not demanding entry. Cautiously, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she peered through the peephole, her breath fogging the cold glass. And there he was, the wolf. He stood against the swirling white, a magnificent, imposing figure. His fur was thicker now, a dense, grizzled mantle against the cold, and his gait, though weary, was strong. But there was no mistaking him. The distinctive, jagged scar above his left eye, a testament to the snare and her intervention, stood out starkly against his dark fur. His amber eyes, once filled with pain and defiance, now held a profound intensity, a mixture of awe and trepidation stirring within her. It was a gaze that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement across the species divide. Her wolf had returned. But he wasn't alone. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, snow-filtered light, her breath caught in her throat. Behind him, huddled against the relentless blizzard, were two more adult wolves, a sleek, dark-furred female, her mate, and another male, younger but equally formidable. And, most astonishingly, three small, shivering pups, barely larger than house cats, their tiny bodies trembling uncontrollably in the swirling snow. They were all gaunt, their ribs visible beneath their matted fur, their eyes reflecting the same desperate hunger and exhaustion she had seen in the lone wolf 6 months prior. The male wolf, her wolf, looked at her, his gaze unwavering, then nudged one of the pups gently with his nose,
pushing it closer to the faint warmth emanating from her cabin door. It was an action that transcended instinct, a deliberate, profound gesture. It was a profound, unspoken plea, a desperate gambit, born of the harshest winter in memory.
The wolf, once a solitary survivor, had not merely returned out of gratitude, though that silent acknowledgement was surely there in his eyes. He had returned out of an extreme, primal necessity, an act of trust so absolute it defied all rational understanding. He had led his entire family, his mate, the sleek female, the other pack member, and his 3 vulnerable offspring to the one human he had learned.